take the war in Gaza, right? And we're now on the tail of all of these college protests we've witnessed in our finest institutions. Apparently an endless number of people expressing sympathy for the Palestinians and even sympathy for Hamas, and which is just officially a genocidal death cult. I mean, it describes itself as a genocidal death cult, and they seem, everything to my eye morally seems upside down. I mean, they can't distinguish the difference between people who use human shields versus people who are deterred by the use of human shields. They can't distinguish people who intentionally burn families alive from people who inadvertently, kill innocent people, trying to kill the people who burn families alive intentionally. So there's just so many asymmetries here. But what's amazing is you have these protests on college campuses effectively silencing even some of the most powerful people in our society. I mean, even just celebrities who you'd think would be totally unconcerned to express their opinion. They're being silenced. They understand that there's a difference between Hamas and the IDF. They won't say anything in support of Israel because it's just too toxic in Hollywood or among Fortune 500 corporations. They're so worried about being boycotted and public backlash, especially on social media. And yet on the other side, there are people signing, the celebrities are signing letters in support of the Palestinians, and they're not at all concerned to be mistaken for people who support Hamas or even outright anti-Semitic. So there's that asymmetry of public opinion, and yet there was just yesterday a Harvard-Harris poll that revealed that 75% of Americans are all in for Israel. They think Israel should just rout out Hamas tomorrow in Rafah, right? I mean, everyone's been debating whether the IDF should go into Rafah, and it's an absolutely tortured debate. 75% of Americans say go into Rafah and kill Hamas, right? That's where public sentiment actually is. And yet we have built a machine, right, where even the most powerful people in our society are terrified of the 25%. They're busily offending, either by their silence or by their support for Hamas, effectively, 75% of America, and they don't even know it because everything is so distorted. The whole information landscape is so distorted based on the capture of certain elite institutions by some very confused people on the left, and what we've done on social media. I mean, everyone's just looking at X thinking, oh my God, everyone supports, everyone thinks Israel is guilty of genocide. I should keep my head down here. I know Israel is not guilty of genocide, if the word means anything, but this is just too dangerous. And yet, in terms of the actual public sentiment of the people who could buy the tickets to your next film, it's completely reversed in reality.
And I think one of the reasons that is, there are obviously lots of reasons, but one of the reasons is in the social media age, the cognitive bias of, oh my God, I am seeing horror on my screen, therefore this is wrong, right, automatically, is very hard to overcome. And it's very difficult to argue against that. When you're seeing, look, I'm a father. When you see dead babies being pulled out of rubble by their parents, like there's no human being alive unless they're a psychopath that doesn't go, oh my God, this is awful. And this should stop immediately, right? But does that really reflect the nature of reality? No. But we also have a significant portion of the population that cannot think past their emotions. But that notwithstanding, 75% of Americans think they should go into Rafah.
I
think your point is well taken. I wasn't disputing that at all. And I think your point about the fact that there are different conversations happening in different places, I think is absolutely right. My point is, I think one of the reasons for that is 75% of Americans are not sitting and looking at their phone every day for 8 hours watching children being blown apart and whatever. But those people who are interested in what's going on and are looking into it, they are not able to think past, I have seen one image.
Yeah, dead babies. Yeah.
And dead babies are bad. I think we can all say that, right? I mean, it's
Pretty
not
officially.
it's uncontroversial. But being confronted with the nature of war and thinking that it's horrible, I think is a useful thing in terms of really being reluctant to get into wars unless it's absolutely necessary. On the other hand, you have to be able to see past your emotional, visceral reaction in some situations and say, why is this war happening? What is the objective of this war? Who is responsible for this baby being pulled out of rubble? Who is it? Is it the people who are going in to kill terrorists? Or is it the terrorists who are using the baby as a human shield?
How do you run that moral math? How do you get everyone to run the same moral math?
I don't think you can. I don't think look, this sounds elitist and snobby. I don't think everyone's capable of it. And we see evidence of that every day. A lot of people like to operate solely by emoting. And we now have tools that encourage them to do so.
Well, people can get better at consuming video, right? I mean, we know we're bad at this, and we should spell out why people are bad at this. So you see a video of some guy being beaten senseless by a crowd, right? And it starts in the middle of the emergency. He's getting, he's already down, and he's getting punched by and kicked by 5 people. He certainly looks like the victim, right? But you have to understand that you don't know what happened just before the clip started, right? You don't know. So I've seen video like that where I assumed, okay, this is an atrocity. This guy's obviously the victim, and yet I find out that this guy just stabbed someone, and he's being subdued by a bunch of unarmed, terrified people, right? Right. So it was exactly backwards, right? And so we know that even when things seem absolutely obvious based on the clip, they could be exactly the opposite of what you think. And so it is with scenes from Gaza. I mean, this was, I remember Rogan at one point was analyzing, I forget who he was talking to, but he had some clip of, 5 guys being bombed in Gaza as though this were proof of war crimes. And these were obviously unarmed, young men, and who were just walking. They seemed to be guilty of nothing other than walking, and they got hit by, looked like a drone, or it was not clear, but they were killed, and yet we have no idea what happened before that clip started, right? So we don't know whether they just planted an IED and it was absolutely obvious that they were combatants and it was totally valid within the rules of war to target them. You just don't know, right? So we have to become better consumers of our own emotional reactivity in response to admittedly disturbing imagery, whatever the actual accurate interpretation.
Do you have a method for that?
Well, it's just to continually price in my uncertainty about those kinds of variables, but the truth is, honestly, my method has been to spend much less time on social media. I deleted my Twitter account. So now when I look at X, it's just because someone has driven me there, like, you have to see this. And then occasionally I'll look at my feed. So I have a feed on X that's not following anyone, and on which I have basically clicked nothing apart from occasionally getting sent a video that has brought me there, or a post that's brought me there. And I am amazed at what a digital sewer it is in terms of what it is trying. I mean, the algorithm seems to just want me to be terrified of the world and probably racist in at least 2 directions, right? It wants to show me black people beating up white people and white people beating up black people, in classrooms all over America. Like, how much this happens, who knows? But or a security cam video of just somebody being horribly murdered for whatever reason, or just accident. I mean, it's just, and then obviously there's the occasional cute cat video, but it's like we have built there's
white cats beating up black cats and vice versa.
But I mean, we've created a psychological experiment and enrolled everybody.
Yeah. And
it's analogous to watching local news all the time. I mean, I learned 30 years ago or longer that I didn't want to spend much time watching local news because there's always just some depressing car chase or, somebody was raped. It's like, I don't need to know this. It's not actually going to change what I do. And it's just this tawdry regurgitation of human misery. And there's always at least another, no matter how small the locality, maybe certainly in any big city is big enough to always have some horror that can be broadcast into your brain about which you're going to do absolutely nothing, and it doesn't make sense for you to even be cognizant of it, and yet it's there to depress you. And social media has become this on a global stage, and it's just, again, it's not that I want people to be oblivious to what's happening in the world. I do want to know. I want to have a map that fits the territory. I want to know what the rates of violent crime actually are, et cetera. But those data are communicated very differently, and they often don't track the imagery that we all get in our heads just by looking at a scroll, right? You see this is what's so distorting about these videos. Most people on the left, certainly anyone left of center in America, thinks very likely that we have an epidemic of lethal police violence against young black men, right? That it's totally rational if you're a black parent to have the talk with your young black son. If he goes out there, he's much more likely to get killed by the cops than his white friends. And this is just an intolerable legacy of racism in America. As far as the stats go, the best understanding of what the dynamics of actual police violence and the 1,000 people every year thereabouts who get killed by the cops, we know that's bullshit. Right, it's just not what's happening. The likelihood that you're going to get killed once you come into contact with the cops, if you're black, is not higher than if you're white. Right, but everyone has seen 12 videos that makes it seem like they're these lunatic cops performing lynchings, and they haven't seen the analogous and in fact more numerous cases where unarmed white people have been killed by cops. Once again, disgracefully, in many cases, but the actual stats are just show you how infrequent it is that an unarmed person of any color gets killed by the cops in America. It's just not happening very often. It's around it's maybe 40 people a year, a majority of whom are not black, and of the 1,000, and among those unarmed people who get killed by cops, most of them are not peacefully. Most of them are trying to kill the cops. They're wrestling with the cops. They're trying to get the gun out of the cops' hands. It's not like the cops are routinely killing nonviolent people in America, and yet we have a kind of pornography of racial grievance that is continually advertising a different story to us. And again, so. Given the dynamics of social media, that is always going to prevail. That's just like because of the algorithmic incentive to spread the outrage.
Other than, Sam, the pursuit of truth, which I think the point you were just making is actually a very good example of where the genuine pursuit of truth and context. In Russia, there's a Russian saying, everything is understood in comparison, right? And what you're talking about is a very good example of where actually finding out what the data is not only is useful, but it actually can change your life, especially if you're a young black man, because you are then less likely to go into that police interaction with the expectation that you will be killed, which means you're going to act differently, which means that you're probably less likely to be killed as a result, right? Knowing that context, knowing that what the statistics are, it is going to inform you to behave in a different way. And this is what I was going to make. I'm actually really reluctant to get involved in the Gaza conversation beyond some basic obvious things, just because I don't know enough about it. But I think one of the critical things in analyzing this conversation, like many others, is the importance of history. And that's the context in which human beings operate, in the history of human beings. Thomas Sowell, who I pretty much worship at this point, he's written extensively about the idea that the best way to understand what people are likely to do in the future is to look at what they've done in the past. And you can slice that 100 different ways. If you find clay tablets from ancient Egypt, they're going to be likely basically discussing the same things that human beings discuss now. My son doesn't, a mother complaining about her son not being around and all this other human stuff. So when we are looking at the conflict in Gaza, I only bring it up because we've been talking about it. I've been trying to say to people, well, if we are going to talk about this seriously, let's look at previous situations in which conflicts of this nature have broken out, for one reason or another, and how has that happened? People give the example of Fallujah, and I think Coleman Hughes actually did a very good job with Joe talking about this on his podcast. But beyond that, whether it's the Japan at the end of World War II, whether it's what happened in Germany at the end of World War II, whether it's previous situations in which a group of people have attacked another people and then lost that fight. How does that normally go? How have we treated this in history? That gives you a context that is very useful for offsetting the visceral experience you have when you're confronted with the reality of war, which is horrific. So in that sense, as you know, my big concern about the direction of the West is that we are becoming divorced from our history on so many different ways, and we are being sold a bunch of lies about how we got here and who we are. And that's just one tiny sliver of that, one tiny sliver. So the fact that the overwhelming majority of people in our societies, and I include to some extent myself in this, are either uneducated or miseducated about history, is a lot of the reason we are where we are, because that context gives you the ability to be the guy who doesn't get killed by the cops, effectively, right? That context, that truth is how you know that you need to act in a particular way to get the best possible outcome in that situation. Which is why I'm just always talking about the need to teach kids history and contextualize. This is one of the things I personally was very fortunate to get from what was actually a reasonably good Soviet education system, and also my parents,
All right, there's an idea that's under the surface of all this that I think, Sam, ties back to what you were talking about, that social media deranges people because you're seeing things that aren't necessarily true, but cognitive biases like recency bias, I've seen a bunch of these attacks. And so my mental model just begins to map to the things that I've seen. And so this must be true. Also maps what you're talking about, where people are steering by not what gives them predictive validity of future action, but instead, how do I make sense of the way that I feel? And if they're making sense of, oh, I see this thing and I don't like the way that it makes me feel, it must be wrong. And here is the post hoc explanation of why the baby being pulled from the rubble is wrong. Not putting it into historical context or context of what war is or anything like that. Just, I have a feeling, this feeling's not good, therefore this is bad, and I need to give some rationalization. All right, so you put that in the social media blender, and now all of a sudden, I don't know which way is up anymore, and I just react to my feelings. The reason I think this question is so important is when people don't have a method by which they determine the truth, which is about predictive validity, you will not end up running the same mathematics. So everyone needs to agree on what the outcome is that we desire, and then they have to run the scientific method. That to me is the only way that these deranging problems of our current moment of social media, plus we haven't even talked about AI, but those two things put together I think are going to be maximum in terms of their impact on derangement, because it gives everybody an N of one frame of reference. And there have been a couple times where you guys have said things that I have seen the public light you both up for because they just disagree so violently. And
really, what would be an example with me?
Yeah, God.
I may not have noticed it because I really don't give a shit. But
yeah, so you were saying something about the Israel-Palestine conflict and the reason that people think that it's bad and that war is bad and that this has to stop. But I think the reality is there's actually two things going on. The moment you bring up Israel-Palestine, if you're talking about anything other than the following two narratives, you're not talking about the reality of why people respond the way they respond. Number one is the Norm Finkelstein stance, which nobody just addresses him head on. He does not believe Israel should exist as a state, period, end of story. Every word he says after that is predicated on Israel should not exist as a state. And if you're approaching him anyway, and people that believe what he believes, without simply debating whether Israel has a right to exist, you're arguing about the T. He's never going to agree with you. He's just going to start yelling and shouting because he has to square.
He's an
Israel
example of
shouldn't
one of
exist.
these PhDs that we need not invite to the conference.
We actually just had him on, and we had a
How'd
good
that go?
hour and a half of actually very useful. I think it's very useful. This is why we will continue to have some of these people on the show, because if these are people to whom a lot of other people are listening, you have to hear what they have to say.
No, but that's a self-reinforcing
Sorry, Sam.
error loop.
Let me just finish the point. You have to hear what they have to say, and then see the method that people have increasingly become addicted to is the idea that the way to get to the truth is to quote unquote destroy someone with facts and logic in a debate. I believe quite often, and this is what we try to do on the show, the way to do that is to have a conversation and just go, okay, let's hear what you have to say and let's ask you some probing questions, and then people can see for themselves the cognitive flaws in biases in what you're saying. For example, in our conversation with him and Bassem Youssef, who are two of the big anti-Israel, pro-Palestine talking heads, it became very clear that neither of them had ever thought about how this might be resolved. That's a useful piece of information to know when you're listening to these people, right? Another thing, with Norman, for example, we spent the first 20 minutes hearing his family story, and he talked about how, his parents were Stalinists, and he thought that was a bit extreme, so he's just a Maoist. That's a helpful piece of information.
Wait, was he being serious?
Yeah.
That wasn't tongue in cheek.
He's a Maoist. Yeah.
Okay.
He's a Maoist.
I would love to ask a follow-up question on that.
Do I need to then have a debate with Norman Finkelstein to destroy the idea of Maoism, or is it sufficient for most people to go, okay, that's the perspective from which he's coming?
I would like to answer that question directly. So you guys both have the right to live your life however you want according to my value system, and so I want you to thrive in ways as you define it. But I think it is incredibly important that people that have the ability to parse through things, not based on emotion, but based on predictive validity towards an agreed upon outcome that is noble and honorable. And therefore, this was something you brought up earlier, and I wanted to address, which is I would request of people that are like the two of you that you address any problem that gains sufficient momentum in culture. And so it can't be derived based on, I think this person is a good faith actor. It just can't. It has to be derived around, but this idea is gaining sufficient cultural momentum. And therefore, if I choose to step into that into the arena of helping people make sense of the world, I'm going to address these ideas. Obviously, that's an ask that I have no right to make of anybody, but that's what I want from people that I see as uniquely capable. Now, I have a frame of reference where I look at human beings as flesh-based AI, and I just want to point the Konstantin flesh-based AI at a given problem and see how he addresses it. I want to point the Sam flesh-based AI at a given problem and see how he handles it. Now, that's brought a ton of pain and suffering into both of your lives. I get that.
I don't know why you keep saying that. It
Okay,
honestly
not
hasn't.
yours. No, Sam's, it certainly
pain
has.
and suffering on his podcast.
Yeah. If you like that clip, check out the full powerful episode here, and I'll see you there.